stage, the honeymoon stage. And then what happens is as we enter into the next stage, the power struggle stage, just in terms of timelines, we're going to go through each of these stages in a little more detail. The power struggle stage doesn't tend to follow the shortened timeline. Power struggle stage of a relationship can literally be for 15 years, 20 years, 30 years in relationships. So when you're in that sort of dynamic, this is often where relationships start suffering. And for those of you who have never made it beyond that stage of a relationship, a lot of people will historically ask me things like, hey, how do I stay in the honeymoon stage forever? But that's not really the question you want to be asking. So we'll talk about that in a few moments. And if we get out of the power struggle stage, there's usually a few really crucial things we did right that then move us into the stability stage of relationships. And that stage will generally be like a more short-lived stage. We get really comfortable in a relationship. We start to have let down our walls, learn the important lessons that the power struggle stage of relationships brings. And then we move into the commitment stage and then the bliss stage. So when we talk about how do we make it to the bliss stage of the relationship, and the bliss stage is sort of like the honeymoon stage, but with more unconditional love. And the reason for this is in order to leapfrog through the different stages, we had to actually do a whole bunch of different things right that included really dropping our mask, not being on our best behavior, opening up, practicing vulnerability, accepting one another's flaws, seeing each other's flaws, and letting each other in more effectively. And there's all these really powerful things that have to take place between that dating or honeymoon stage to the bliss stage that actually deepen the bond of a relationship and make the trust stronger and the connection better across time. And so when we talk today about how what's the secret to getting to the bliss stage? Well, the secret to getting to the bliss stage is to thrive and take the very key lessons away from each stage along the track so that you can reach that stage in its total fruition. So we're going to talk a lot about we'll talk a little bit about the attachment style dynamics and key things to pay attention to for each attachment style. But we're really going to discuss today these strong overarching themes of what are the focuses. So if you're in this part of a relationship now, with somebody, then great, you can focus in. But if you're not in a relationship now, throughout the webinar today, I would highly recommend that you take the time to really sit in and think of, where do I usually go wrong in relationships in the past? Where are my challenges in each of these different areas? Where do relationships usually end for me? Most people, it's the power struggle stage. Some people, it's in the stability stage. Some people, it's right when there's a big commitment in the commitment stage. So try to think of where did relationships go wrong for me? What stage was I at? And this will help you take those key lessons away so that you can be intentional next time around and not get tripped up at the same place over and over again. So as I mentioned, a lot of people will say, how do you stay in the honeymoon stage forever? But that's the wrong question to be asking. When people have never made it beyond that power struggle stage, they think, oh, I just have to go back into the honeymoon stage. And so their expectation at a subconscious level of what relationships are supposed to be are that the relationship is either going to be at this all-time high of infatuation or in this crazy power struggle with all of these pain points and challenges. And so this is where you'll see people who enter into that power struggle stage start going, oh, I don't know if this is the right relationship. I think I should leave. Instead of seeing that as a stepping stone towards further growth and deepening of the bond and connection, if key crucial things are done correctly. So you'll see this dynamic. And what I'll often see, and one thing that can be really challenging is that, especially for APs and FAs, if they haven't made it beyond this stage, they think that they have to keep this attraction and chemistry and infatuation at this all-time high in a relationship, when it's actually just a stepping stone into deepening a connection. And when that deepening of a connection happens, it ends up really outweighing and overpowering that intensity from the dating and honeymoon stage. And it actually ends up the relationship becomes so much more stronger on the other side. So we would do well to ask instead how we can use each stage of the relationship for its necessary teachings, learnings, and growth opportunities, both individually and as a couple. Okay. So as I go through each of these stages, I want you to try to, and if you feel comfortable sharing in the chat, I'd love to hear at the end of each stage, but I'd really love to hear where you find yourself getting stuck. So the dating stage overall at a high level is supposed to be for vetting. It's supposed to be having different attachment styles like lean in to find balance where they may be going wrong. So what we'll often see is like dismissive avoidance in the dating stage. They can often be flaw finding, and they'll see a red flag and they'll get out of there. They're like, oh, red flag. APs will see a red flag and they'll be people pleasing. They're not flaw finding. They're doing the opposite. If they feel some sort of attraction or connection on any level, they generally tend to be like, oh, how can I make this person like me back and be interested in me and want to commit to a relationship with me, because they haven't really taken the time to be intentional. So they'll see a red flag and often ignore it. And then fearful avoidance will usually see red flags, ignore them until all of a sudden they're out of there. And they'll leave suddenly when those red flags have built up enough, but they're often not having conversation to unpack those red flags in the meantime to be able to get to the bottom of what's really taking place. So we'll see this huge like limitation in this stage of a relationship. Now, the key lessons, like, so if we want to become masters of each stage of the relationship overall, so that we can fast track to that bliss stage and really feel empowered in our connection, one of the most important lessons is to be intentional ahead of time. And the whole idea of the dating stage, like if you want to do dating consciously, you want to understand ahead of time, what are my non-negotiables in relationships? What are my standards and what are my preferences? Okay. And we have a whole other webinar about that if you want to check it out. So I'm not going to go into it too much right now, but to really know like what your needs are from dating essentially, and what the things are in dating that are like absolutely not okay with you. Like, is it if somebody smokes? Is it if somebody, has never been in a long-term relationship before? Is it if somebody doesn't want to have children or does want to have children? Like, what are your non-negotiables? And you have to define those all like ahead of time. And I really can't tell you how many times I've had relationship discussions or seen people in relationships who are like, oh, they said they don't want kids, but they'll probably change their mind. Or, they do this thing that I'm really not okay with at any point, but it'll change over time. And what almost always ends up happening is that the thing doesn't change and the person just wastes 2 years of their lives. And of course, you'll learn things and there's lessons and things like that. But really, it's so important to know your non-negotiables and your desires, your standards, like what you want ahead of time, so that you don't just go into dating on autopilot. Because one of the things we know is anything that's left on autopilot will ultimately suffer. We'll learn the lessons the hard way when we're on autopilot. So we want to be intentional ahead of time. And then the whole dating stage should be used to figure out where that person is at and if you fit into that person's life as well. So you really want to take that intentionality and be like, okay, I have to ask the right questions to get to the bottom of these things. And when we see red flags in the dating stage of a relationship, FAs and DAs, at least part of the FA is usually like, oh, a red flag, that means I should cut and run. Like I should just get out of there. Red flags are points of discussion. Unless you see a red flag that's like clearly falling into your non-negotiable category, the vast majority of red flags are solvable problems. And we'll often see people in the dating stage, there'll be a red flag, like maybe somebody's coming on too strong. And maybe a DA or FA is like, oh, it's too much, I can't be with them. But sometimes if you just had a conversation and set a boundary and said, hey, I want to move slower, or, hey, like this is really fast for me, I'm not ready to move this quickly, I'm not really in the same headspace as you, would you be open to taking this more slowly? A lot of the time, by just enforcing boundaries and stating needs, these things that are making you want to flee are actually solvable problems. So we have to do the due diligence as an individual to communicate in the dating stage what our needs are as well, and to let people know when we have boundaries. So you almost want to, like in the dating stage, and we're going to talk a ton about this in the course at the end of the month, but like you really want to sit down and be like, okay, am I clear about what I want? You almost want like a little checklist for yourself. Am I clear about what I want? And that should not be a rigid thing. Like the person has to have everything on my checklist. It should be an intentional thing. These are the things that I would really like, so I can go out and find people in areas where I'm likely to meet these things on the checklist. Something I always say to you guys is like, if you're deciding I want somebody who meditates every day and likes health and wants to be somebody who's always personally growing and self-developing and is ambitious, you probably don't want to find that person at a nightclub, right? So like, we want to be like, what are my needs? And where am I going to meet somebody that aligns with these needs, right? So we're getting off autopilot. And then you want to be able to turn around and go, okay, so here we are, I'm in this position. And now I also would like to have dialogues if I see something doesn't feel right, if something feels uncomfortable. And then I'm empowering myself to have proper communication in a relationship. So I'm communicating my needs and my boundaries. Okay. All of these things need to be done effectively if you want to move on to the honeymoon stage, and have success in the dating stage of a relationship, meaning that you're doing the things that are setting you up for success in the continuous phases of the relationship to come. So some of the really key lessons you want to pay attention to are things like, am I clear about what I want? Am I setting my boundaries? Am I communicating my needs? Am I showing up intentionally to invest in places where I'm going to meet people like this? And am I being honest and vulnerable enough to communicate effectively in the early stage? Generally, we'll see DAs are like, I'm just going to sit back and judge you and vet you and see what's going on and then not open myself up. And then we'll see, fearful avoidance be like, I'm going to people please. And then secretly inside, hold on to all the things I don't like until I've decided that that's enough. And then we'll see APs be like, okay, I'm just going to, oh, I like you a little bit. I find that there's one or two things I like about you. I'm just going to try to win you over this entire time. And I don't care what I want. And so like, there will be these dynamics and you have to sit there and look like, where are you at with this? And how are you going to move the needle to come into harmony to really work on the things that you may not be doing so you can have success in this stage of relationships. Okay. So that's dating stage. And, some of the questions have to be done, and we'll talk about that in the live course in more detail, but some of the questions have to be like you finding out if you see a red flag. Is this person always like this? Is this something that they're willing to work on and change? If you're like, if somebody is a big person into health and they meet somebody and they're like, wow, all these things about this person are absolutely fantastic, but they smoke a pack of cigarettes a day. And for me, that's a big thing against my highest need for health, let's pretend. And then you might go, okay, well, like, rather than just going, okay, that's it, I'm out of here. What if that person was like about to start trying to quit smoking the next day, right? So we can set deadlines around things, we can negotiate, communicate, open ourselves. And at worst, we're empowering ourselves to be effective communicators in relationships going forward, right? So at worst, we are still able to show up and dialogue things out as needed. So that is the dating stage. Okay. Honeymoon stage. So honeymoon stage is like once we've moved the needle into or out of the dating stage, because there's some form of commitment. Now the honeymoon stage is generally characterized by having like rose-colored glasses on a little bit. We hear like the expression like love is blind or things like this. And sometimes when we've got those rose-colored glasses on and when we're really infatuated, we can also ignore red flags. And so it's something to sort of keep in the back of your mind and to really just be like conscious and intentional about how you're showing up in this stage. Now we sort of have this like neurochemical cocktail that happens in the honeymoon stage, and it can really start ramping up like partway through the dating stage. But we have elevated levels of oxytocin, the bonding neurochemical, serotonin, the well-being neurochemical when we're around somebody, dopamine, the motivation neurochemical, and infatuation-inducing phenylethylamine, which makes us feel more infatuated and attracted and all these different things. Now, generally, if we're in the honeymoon stage and we are over the top infatuated or we're in limerence, there does tend to be a pattern with the higher we put somebody on a pedestal in the honeymoon stage, the greater the fall. And I don't mean this to be like cynical, but generally when we have somebody on this huge pedestal, whoever you put on a pedestal is way above yourself. You have unhealthy expectations of the vast majority of the time. You think they're perfect. So when they do make a mistake, when they do not meet a need, when they do, let something down, generally this is characterized by this peak of infatuation followed by like a sort of valley of resentment, right? You're on the roller coaster. So it is important if you do see yourself in this stage of a relationship and you're just like, wow, you just have this person on this massive pedestal. We don't want to get into limerence in this stage. We don't want to feel like, and we can get into limerence in the dating stage. If you've been watching the limerence content, you can get into limerence without even being in a relationship with somebody of any consistent format. But when you see this happening, and if you see this happening, significantly, you want to do some trait variety work in this, is sort of golden shadow work, in this stage. So if you have somebody on such a pedestal, What this means is that there's voids within yourself that you see this person as meeting. And so you're probably like, oh my gosh, these traits they're expressing represent repressed traits within myself. So maybe you're so attracted to somebody, it's sort of like a bit of shadow work. Maybe you're so attracted to somebody who is ambitious because maybe you're in a position where you don't know what you want to do next in your life, right? So you feel like that element of your personality is repressed. And so from a trait variety perspective, we're always seeking wholeness even through other people. And so we'll over attach to these expressed traits in somebody and we'll hold on to them so tightly. But this will lead us to put people on a pedestal. And then obviously, whenever we have those really strong elevated expectations, we can feel really let down or disappointed long-term. So you want to be mindful that you're not in this like destabilized space in the honeymoon stage of a relationship. And if you are finding yourself, list out the traits you're so attracted to that you think are in such a pedestal, and then look for where you have those traits already in the relationship to yourself, or where you are in a position where you are not nourishing those traits within yourself actively. Okay. So when you're looking at these different dynamics, you want to make sure that you're not too destabilized. And also this can happen in the form of needs. So if somebody meets a need that you don't know how to meet without this person, we can often overattach in this stage as well. Now, there's nothing wrong with like having great infatuation and feeling really good in this relationship, as long as you're mindful of those things and you have healthy expectations. And what you'll find is you'll have this really enjoyable, like elevated level of excitement around somebody, infatuation, but it won't be something that like causes you to destabilize your life. Like, oh, I'm not going to show up to work. I'm just going to call out of work all the time to spend time with this person. Like you're not going to make irrational decisions that cause you to self-abandon, betray, or harm other areas of your life, like your career, your relationship to money, right? This is a huge one. Sometimes people will be so in this like dating stage and, oh, wow, that suddenly they're like spending all their money. And you're like, wait, save your money, be responsible with your money. But we're like, oh, I have to impress the person, or I have to buy all these new clothes and all these new things so that I can look good and the person will want me. And it's like, okay, if you find yourself self-abandoning or causing indirect harm to other areas of your life, you're in too much limerence, you want to reel it in a little bit. You want to sort of calm down, get more grounded, do some of that trait work, do some of that needs work, and just make sure you're like consciously approaching your dating life. Because what we don't want to do is use love to sabotage other areas, right? That means there's stuff going on. So you want to be really careful there and really clear about that, so we're not falling too much into limerence. And then also, the faster we start being vulnerable and sharing our truth in the honeymoon stage, the smoother the preceding stages will tend to go. So the faster we can, start sharing our fears, our flaws, be honest. So if you have like, an insecurity around something and it's bothering you, sometimes in the honeymoon stage, we still have that mask on really strongly. And so sometimes we'll be like, oh, I can't share that, right? Oh, that's an imperfection, I can't share it. Or if somebody's hurting your feelings, or let's say somebody's not calling you back as much as you would like them to, sometimes we'll see APs and FAs go, oh, it's fine. Like, it's not a big deal. I'm not going to share that with them. I don't want them to like me less, or, and it's really important. In fact, if we want to continue building healthy, positive momentum that's going to propel us out to the bliss stage of relationships long-term, it's very important that we take the time to start sharing ourselves truthfully. Okay. We don't have to share every single little tiny thing. You probably won't think of every single little tiny thing at the time. But what you really want to be able to do, if something bothers you, you're setting the precedent and building that foundation out to start having healthy and vulnerable communication. And what you'll see is the more you are opening up in the honeymoon stage, that is generally going to correlate with how smooth versus how rocky the power struggle stage is. So if you start sharing more of your flaws, your fears, your needs, your boundaries, if they're being violated, the more you start talking about these things early, the less they're going to feel like bombs dropped in the power struggle stage. And I've shared this before with you guys. When we've talked about different stages of relationships, and like I've had many, many, many conversations with people over the years in my practice who would say things to me like, I just thought my wife was the most amazing person. And then we got married and then she turned into a monster. And like, I've heard this so many times. And then I'd be like, okay, so like, how early did you get married? And they'd be like, oh, 6 months in, we knew. And so we got engaged, at a year, and we got married 6 months later. And it's like, oh, so you got married before the power struggle stage, basically. And so what you're not expecting is that you haven't actually had the wisdom, in a sense, the opportunity to build the wisdom about the other person that you're in a relationship with. And so it feels like there's this big change, but those big changes are basically indicative of entering into the power struggle stage and the mask coming off. Okay. So dating and honeymoon, if you're too people pleasing, you're too on your best behavior, you're not making space for yourself, your own needs to share and express and communicate about your own insecurities, it's going to be like walking off the edge of the cliff when you enter into the power struggle stage. So just some really important things to keep in mind, and different things you want to discuss in this stage is like, the frequency and expectations of communication. How often you think you should communicate, the frequency and expectations of how often you should see each other. Great thing to really discuss and get clear on is your love languages, your needs in a relationship. So what is really important to you to feel like a relationship is fulfilling, and what your boundaries are in a relationship. So if you have your own like little personal checklist, how can I navigate this stage really well? You want to talk about those things. And if you're having core wounds come up in that stage of relationships, if you're feeling unsafe, if you're feeling unseen, if you feel like you don't matter, if you feel like you're being shamed and you feel defective, have these dialogues. Let this person know what your sensitivities are. And this is really going to help going into the next stage. So we're going to unpack the power struggle stage in a lot of detail for a moment. And we're going to talk about how to really have those conversations. Because ideally, a huge component of getting through the next couple of stages here are you have to give somebody the information necessary to learn you. And if you are not giving somebody the necessary information to learn about you, what your pain points are, your insecurities, your flaws, your needs, then you're constantly going to feel like the person doesn't consider you. Right? You're going to be like, they don't do this thing that I really need them to do. But if you haven't told them, it's really not their fault. And if we have this idea or concept, it's such a like deal breaking expectation in relationships. If you have this idea or concept that goes, if they love me, they should know, then you're doing yourself a great disservice, because that's not how it works. So before we dive into the power struggle stage, if you feel comfortable, I would love to hear the main things that you see yourself struggle with. So if you want to share your attachment style and the main things you see yourself struggle with, either in the dating stage or the honeymoon stage. And it can be like in a current relationship you are in, it can be in a recent relationship. It can be like where you see yourself go wrong in relationships. Like, oh, I start building this pattern and I start moving in this direction, and I can see what's taking place here. Like I'm self-abandoning, or I'm people pleasing too much in these stages, or I still feel like, oh, I have to be in my best behavior and I can't really open up too much to somebody else. Okay. So I hear, let me see here. So I hear people pleasing out of fear. That's a really good one. And fear, and I would really get clear of like fear of what, right? So take some time and be like, I'm afraid that I will be not good enough. I'm afraid that I will be abandoned. I'm afraid of, and then working through that fear as you go in, because it's interesting. Whenever we people please out of fear, whatever we're afraid of the other person doing is ultimately what we're just doing to ourselves, right? Like, well, I'm afraid of being abandoned. Oh, well, then I'm just going to abandon myself. Or I'm afraid of being betrayed. I'm just betraying myself in the situation. So you'll see that dynamic really take place early on. FA, hi Janelle, FADA honeymoon is everything is a red flag. That's a good one. That's called self-preservation, right? That's called like, I'm in a position where I'm going, okay, I am going to flaw find all these different things as a strategy for self-protection. And so I don't have to attach. And so I'm not disappointed. Right. And ultimately it's so interesting. So my husband and I were watching this show on Netflix called Indian Matchmaking. And we started watching it like a few days ago. And there's this one woman on it, and she is like, why can't I find a relationship? And, you know, she's got like her life together. She's got all these nice things on paper. And she's like, why can't I find a relationship? And like, you see her when she's dating and she's so closed off, like just so closed off. And she does these funny things where she like won't reach out to people, or it's almost like she's trying to make them feel rejected. because I don't know what she's expecting, that they like chase her. And if they're not bending over backwards, that like, they're just not worth it. She's going to like be spiteful and all these things. And she goes through the show and she's like, why can't I find somebody? And she keeps bringing it up. And it's like the biggest self-sabotager of her relationships is herself. And, and people are like, they interview the people separately who are dating her and or going on dates with her. And they'll be like, yeah, she doesn't really like me. Or they'll say, oh, she's not very interested in me, because she's giving like no openness at all. And you just see like, from like a not so like joking perspective, you see like, she's so afraid. Like she's so afraid to like be open. She's so afraid to attach. She's so afraid to feel anything and then be disappointed. And so we do that, right? We go into all of this, like everything's a red flag, self-preservation mode, self-protection. So I don't have to feel or hurt. So really, really good share. FADA, not showing myself or communicating my needs and boundaries. That's such a good one, Jessica. And then we go like this, right? Then we go, you don't care about my needs or my boundaries, so I'm out of here. And it's like, usually the person just had no idea. And a lot of the times, like we're very pleasantly surprised when we do start communicating about needs and boundaries. You'll often be very, very surprised on the other end. Even if people are imperfect, they generally actually try quite hard to be mindful of those things when we give and share that information. Dating stage, I don't need a romantic relationship. I need to be 100% secure to date. Interesting. You know who else does this? DAs do this a lot. And I know you're secure now, but FAs do this a lot too. They go, I have to be perfect before I have to look this way. I have to finish this thing of my life. I have to, and it's like this checklist of all the things I need to be or do or have before I'm even worthy of dating at all. And so you kind of are like entering into that mindset a little bit. So I would work on, it could be like a bit of like an unworthiness core wound, or it could be like a need for control. Like, oh, I don't want to abandon myself in any way. I want to like work on myself first and foremost, but you can still be growing and doing that work in a relationship as well. It can be a little more challenging at times than learning about yourself, behind, the computer screen or behind books or things like that. But ultimately it propels you into that next stage of growth when you're forced to do it in real time with people, have those tough conversations. So, and I think you're more than ready to do that if you decide to. FA, hi, Corey. Over pleasing or thinking the relationship is doomed before it even starts. So I just abandon it. That's such a good share too. It's like this assumption. FAs do this a lot, like this idea of, it's going to end terribly, or I'm just going to open up myself and then get really terribly hurt. And it's like when you go in and you try to love, when you're carrying that in the background, it makes it impossible. It makes it so difficult because you're trying to love and open yourself. And I've had so many conversations with FAs over the years who will say like, oh, love like feels really good when you're falling in love, but it kind of hurts at the same time, or it like feels really like tough at the same time. And I think that's largely because you're opening and loving, and then there's this assumption that it's on its way out. There's this assumption that it's going to end. And so it's this bittersweet kind of feeling to love. And it doesn't have to be that way. That bitter part is representative of beliefs that are there. There will still be challenges in relationships, but those will be things that can grow you with a person the vast majority of the time if you're with somebody who's willing to show up with you. So great share. FA, I think I jump right into the power struggle and stay there or bounce from there. Yeah. And that's powers that can be more so like the honeymoon stage. So you'll see FAs as soon as there's like some kind of commitment, and really it's like attachment. As soon as there's like an attachment and there's that like vulnerability, it's like, ooh, all the attachment trauma comes up, right? That's when it comes to the surface. And sometimes FAs too, powers, I don't know if this is your experience, but sometimes FAs too will be like, will be in this position where they're like really good at the beginning of the dating stage. Like they're very charismatic and they have it all together and they're all charming. And then as soon as they actually feel something real, that's when it feels like, oh my gosh, I'm on the roller coaster all of a sudden. And that's when it can feel really, really overwhelming and tough. So very good share and really good to be aware of. And that represents beliefs you have about relationships that are getting in the way. Okay, I'll do like two more. I love hearing everybody's. Okay, so Scott says, not communicating what I need in a relationship, they should know what I want. That's the best one. That's such a common one, right? And people, if they care about me, they should know. And Scott, I don't know. Yeah, you said you're FADA. this is the thing too, like a lot of FA types, because they're so hypervigilant, you're often so good at reading other people, right? Because that's fearful avoidance. Attachment strategy is hypervigilance, right? APs is to people please, connect, activate. DAs to deactivate, right? And to keep space in their attachment strategy. But like, because there's no consistency, fearful avoidant, the only way they really figure out how to attach is to read between the lines and be really good at like the guessing games and the mind reading tactics and all these different things because of so much unpredictability in your environment growing up. And so for you, then you might be good at mind reading and doing that. You might be good at figuring out and being a great detective and figuring out what somebody wants, but not everybody has that same attachment strategy. Not everybody is cut from that same cloth of conditioning. And so when you can see that and be like, okay, hold on, I'm projecting onto other people that they should be the way I am, that's always going to allow you to open up and facilitate conversation and communication instead of get into like expectation territory where we don't talk about our feelings or needs or any of that stuff. So great share. And then HH says it was self-abandonment and fear of losing the person. Yeah. And so then you go, okay, I'm going to abandon myself and I'm going to people please. And then eventually you're like, oh, I don't feel fulfilled in the relationship. Right. Or you see like the pain points of that or the long-term consequences later on. And I see a few other ones, self-abandonment, under or over communicating in the wrong way. That's a huge one for FAs, Leona, because you'll like under communicate for so long. And then when the time comes to actually communicate, you have so much to say. You've got, yeah, George knows he's got point 1, 2, 3. It's so funny. So you'll see these and it's like, hey, that's symptomatic of not communicating each step of the way overall. So, okay, we'll go into the next parts here. So, the power struggle stage. So obviously this is where like, you know, you want to really, show up and move through as many things as you can early on. But the power struggle stage can begin sometimes if people move very quickly, it can sort of like set off the power struggle stage a little bit earlier. Because the amount of attachment that's there is what really, like, think of the power struggle stage as being like, okay, you're attached enough to somebody and you're comfortable enough with somebody that now the masks naturally start to drop a little bit. And then we tend to make that mean different things, and that can disrupt how we feel about the relationship. And also, whatever our core wounds are that were more dormant in the other stages when our masks were up because we weren't being as vulnerable. When that vulnerability is more open and on board, our attachment trauma rises to the surface. Now, when you think of it this way, it's like the attachment trauma rises to the surface and comes out into the relationship. That means there's like more opportunity to work through those things and to heal from that, right? But if we judge it, if we judge the person, if we deflect, if we don't take accountability for what's showing up, if we don't do the work, then this is where it's like, okay, we just experience pain and suffering. But if we see this stuff and we're like, okay, let me work through this, there's lessons here, there's learning to do, there's growth that's, you know, on the table here for me to take part in, then this is where we can see the power struggle stage actually be something that grows the relationship more than any other stage, and really, really sets you up for success long-term. So we'll generally see the power struggle stage arises. And one of the first things that can be really challenging, especially for fearful avoidance, really, but APs, it can be tough as well, is there's a change in the pattern, right? So like for those of you that are a little hypervigilant, all of a sudden something's changing in the pattern. So now, okay, there's a shift happening, and often incongruency, right? Changes in a sudden pattern can actually trigger trust wounds. So sometimes we'll see like, oh, trust wounds coming up. And in essence, all attachment styles have trust wounds, but they just have them in different forms. So, DAs don't trust people not to invade their space. DAs don't trust people to not neglect them at some level. And so that's part of why they keep people at bay. FAs don't trust people to show up and not betray their trust in all facets and forms, lying, infidelity. There's a lot of distrust. Don't trust somebody to stick around. And then APs generally don't trust somebody not to abandon them. So when the incongruency happens, it already sets the tone for more turbulence to take place. But when we have the knowledge and we can consciously recognize, oh, I see what's going on here. We're entering into the power struggle stage. Now you can see these as the opportunities to deepen the connection by really working through these things effectively. And I'm going to give you a bunch of different examples. So some symptoms of the power struggle stage starting, like and the onset happening, are you'll see more fighting. You'll feel more disconnected a lot of the time, confused. You can feel this like sort of, if you pay close attention, it's like, oh, we didn't really have walls so much before, but walls are coming up and then they're going down and then they're going up and then they're going down. And one that can really challenge people when they don't realize that relationships have stages is sometimes there's less intimacy. So sometimes there's less sex, and it can also be less like physical connection. And it's because that like neurochemical cocktail of all of those original neurochemicals is starting to fade. And so sometimes, somebody will see this as like, oh my gosh, like we're growing apart, the relationship's ending. Like it's so easy to give meaning to these changes when you're not aware of what's happening. And it's all of those things and the fight to then keep the relationship in the honeymoon stage are all of those things that are ultimately going to stop the relationship from really progressing and will stop you from, as a person, feeling truly seen, heard, understood, and known, and feeling like you can really be yourself and open up. And so we don't want to fight to keep the things in the honeymoon stage. We want to deepen the connection and move the needle towards more unconditional love by allowing our inner selves and inner worlds to actually be seen. And so, when you enter into this stage, you'll also see the big lessons in this stage become, and these are, how we keep saying like a checklist in each stage. Think of this as like your lessons checklist, okay, for each stage and how to like propel forward to the bliss stage. Lessons become learning how to communicate, okay? And a lot of you are here and have already learned the steps to communicate. So in that case, it would be practicing communication, really getting good and becoming masterful at resolving conflict. I think a fantastic goal for each and every individual to have who's here and a part of the school is set the intention as a person to become a masterful communicator, like to be somebody who goes, you know what? I trust myself to work through problems, because you're never going to like escape problems. And whenever we're trying to not have problems, oftentimes it's just an avoidance strategy, right? When you're like, oh, I don't want to fight. I don't want to have a problem. I don't want to have an issue with my boss or my partner, whoever it is. Oh, that I just hear when I hear people saying like, oh, we don't fight. I don't fight with my partner. We never fight. When I hear that, I'm like, oh, so you're an avoider. You avoid things because there's going to be points of contention and challenges. And rather than avoiding and keeping the walls up and keeping a distance, how about going headfirst into things and working through them so you continuously see these challenges as opportunities to really deepen the connection? Okay, so when we talk about things like this, like let's say, for example, in the power struggle stage, you're seeing that one person wants more connection and one person wants more space, right? So we can avoid the conflict and we can just say, okay, I'll just give up my need for more connection and I'll just, resort to taking more space because I don't want to rock the boat. But like then one person sacrificed instead of putting everything on the table and both parties negotiating and compromising. And this is like one of the most important things. One of the keys of mastering this stage is proper resolution of issues. So, whenever there's an issue, we don't want to be like, oh no, I'm not going to say anything. We want to be like, how can I get really good at communicating in a way that's not going to set off a negative conflict? So you want to put yourself in a position where you're able to say, okay, I can get clear about what feels wrong for me. And I can get clear about what I need to happen instead. And then I can go to that person and gently let them know what's going on for me in a way where they're not going to take it personally, and let them know what I need instead. And also validate that they may have different needs and that's okay. But let's try to find somewhere we can meet in the middle so that we're both making a compromise instead of one of us sacrificing because we're not going to say anything. And wherever we sacrifice, there will be resentment long-term. Okay. So an example of this would be, let's say you sit down and you say to your partner, hey, I noticed that we're both really busy, but I would like to spend a little bit more time together. And I'm not saying it's anybody's fault, because I know there's a lot going on, but I'm noticing that this feels like it's a need that I want more of. And it really matters to me because I love and value our relationship. Right. So like, no one's going to get mad at you saying that. But also and this is where you see the power struggle stage, just like you jump off the ledge. It's like when you aren't communicating these things, guess how they come out instead? They come out in the form of criticism, right? So we go, oh, I won't say anything. I won't say anything. And then we say, you never spend time with me. You don't want to spend time with me, because where we don't communicate, it's criticism waiting to happen, right? There's that like saying, behind all criticisms is a wish or a need. And so, if you see yourself as a person in any of your relationships criticizing, that's a really good like signpost. Hey, you haven't been communicating. I have to be accountable for communicating. If I see somebody I'm criticizing, okay, I haven't been talking, and that's mine, right? And so somebody may not listen. Somebody may not participate back with me. Somebody may be really unhealthy and not able to reciprocate. And then I can set my boundaries accordingly. But if I'm the person criticizing, if I'm the person distributing poison into a relationship in my life, there's something I should be accountable for. So we want to take a look at that and remember that at all times when we see that taking place. So when you look, okay, we want to go into, are we talking things out? Are we working things through? And we've got other webinars about communication and effective communication. If you want like a little systematic hack, just as a part of this webinar, start by validating the other person's experience. Start by expressing what feels unmet, what you need instead, very clearly and specifically. And then ask the person if they're willing to meet you part way and how they're feeling about the situation. So you leave it kind of open-ended and room for compromise. And if you have somebody who's a little sensitive to criticism, you can follow up with one other like really nice thing at the end. So those can be your sort of steps. So if we do another one, if you feel like the person's not doing chores around the house in the power struggle stage, right? You might say, hey, I know how much work you put into this relationship. I know how much work you put into these other areas of your life. And one thing I notice is I would really appreciate if you could contribute more to, and we can't say things around the house, like you want to be as specific as possible. Can you contribute more to chores, specifically like taking out the garbage on Tuesdays and Thursdays, right? So you're really clear and really specific. And you can say, for me, that would mean a lot because I find myself XYZ, like I find myself feeling overwhelmed at times. And that would make me feel really, really supported. And, are you good with that? Like, do you have room for that? Let's talk about it. Right. So when we can normalize communication like this, then it becomes something where whenever there's a pain point or challenge, both people aren't afraid of talking, right? People aren't afraid of conflict. It's so normal to talk about stuff that there's that, when we get into like a conflict or a fight, sometimes you get that like a little adrenaline rush and fear and nervousness. Eventually that just goes away, right? Eventually you want to talk about something and it's like, you don't think about it first. You're like, oh, okay, this thing has to come up and we have to talk it out. So that, if you can get that right in the power struggle stage, you will set yourself up for everything else to come. Now, there's certain things that are required. Vulnerability, right? It's vulnerable to say your needs. It's vulnerable to ask for what you want. It's scary, especially if you've historically been conditioned to feel like, oh, I can't do that. That doesn't work for me. If you grew up in a household where your needs weren't met, you already have these subconscious beliefs that are acting as blockers or barriers. You already have these subconscious beliefs that say, I can't ask for these things, right? So being vulnerable will be very, very important. Getting good at communicating will be important. Don't expect yourself to be good the first time around. Okay. You may have to practice a little bit. You may have times where it doesn't go perfectly, right? You may have times where it's like, oh, I could have done this differently. The act of practicing over time will create mastery. Right? If you're batting like 50, 60% of what you want to start by communicating, but you keep showing up, eventually you're going to become a fantastic communicator. And that's going to serve you in relationships, friendships, family relationships, workplace relationships, and everything else. So worth practicing, even though it's scary, you can do a little exposure work around it as needed. Being accepting, right? So sometimes when somebody else is dropping their mask, we're like, but you were this way. But we want to be accepting that, like, look, everybody is going to have flaws and imperfections in this stage, and everybody's going to have insecurities. And trying to look for like the sponsoring intention behind people's actions is very valuable for this stage, right? Because instead of going, oh, the person's actually more withdrawn than I expected them to be when they're being themselves, instead of being like, then they're the wrong person, back to flaw finding, back to fleeing the relationship. Instead, we want to be able to go, okay, like this is how they are. And this will be, if it doesn't feel good for me, something that we can talk through and work through and find harmony around. So really, really important to be accepting, open, communicative, and also to make sure that you're dissecting your stories. Because remember, this is a stage where our unresolved attachment trauma rises to the surface. And so whatever you're seeing popping up is something that you want to be able to go, oh, I have these stories left that come out in this area. I have these pain points that show up. Okay, this is a call for me to show up and do the work to reprogram them, to work through them, to question my stories. And one of the most important things that I think you want to look at here, and when you get through the power struggle stage and you continue to progress, a few beautiful things come out of it. Okay. And this is like the general securely attached relationship to the power struggle stage. Number one, the original conversations you had to have are no longer, right? Like eventually what happens is those things where you had to be like, hey, when we are apart on a trip, because I have to travel for work or whatever it is, right? Like when we're apart on a trip, connection's important to me, and having some kind of consistency of connection where we really get time to be present every day on the phone, that matters to me. Maybe those are conversations you have originally, but a few years later or a few months later, if you're just going from one stage to the other in this little period of time, those are new normal, right? Like that's just something that's become a pattern and a routine in a relationship. If you say, okay, quality time is really important to me, we need to have a really quality time date night and a morning routine together. If you've discussed that, eventually that becomes the relationship normal. You don't have to keep talking about stuff. If somebody says, you know what, I need time alone to recharge, every so often at the end of my work week after working all the hours, I kind of just need like a couple hours to like go for a walk or do my own thing. And then that about your partner. You're not like, why are they going for a walk by themselves, right? You're like, oh, they need this. That's their way of recharging. That's their way of showing up. And you appreciate it and understand it and don't personalize it. And so these things, sometimes people would say to me in my practice, but Thais, like, what if we have to talk about stuff with people all the time? Like, what if there's just so much discussion to have? And it's like, sometimes there are extra discussions to have in the power struggle stage. That's the natural evolution of things, because this is where you're doing more of the heavy lifting and the work. But if you approach these topics in a healthy way, you validate each other's feelings, you're kind and respectful when you communicate, you share your needs, you practice vulnerability instead of criticism. If you're doing these things, the discussions are fairly short and they create the opportunity for so much growth as a couple, and obviously as an individual as well, because you're practicing talking through things, you're practicing opening up. So these are really, really important things. And the other things I would say too is like, sometimes we'll see that we give our boundaries away in the power struggle stage, or we do these things that we're like us as children on autopilot. And it's a funny thing to think about, but it's like, because we use our adult romantic relationships to replace our relationships to our caregivers in childhood, sometimes you'll see, like, we talked, I think it was last week about the drama triangle. And we talked about like how there's the rescuer or there's the victim, or there's the persecutor. And we talk about these different roles. And sometimes if you had like a certain place you used to sit, sometimes you'll see yourself kind of go back into that stage more in the power struggle. And these are all opportunities to resolve things you couldn't resolve in childhood, right? These are all opportunities to be like, oh, if I rescue somebody and that becomes my autopilot thing when I'm truly myself more in the power struggle stage, I need to work on that. I need to have my boundaries still in the power struggle stage. Or if I become somebody who pushes everybody away in the power struggle stage and closes off, I better start practicing opening up and practicing vulnerability. And in essence, you're healing unresolved attachment trauma from the past in the present moment through showing up differently when you deeply attach to another person. So Power struggle stage, really important. And when you move out of this, when we move into the stability stage, then you start to see, oh, we don't have to talk about so many things. We've now created habits in the relationship that work for us as a unit. We know each other's pain points. We know each other's insecurities. We know each other's fears. And while each person should be responsible for working on their own individual fears and core wounds and things like that, we also know how to be mindful about each other. So I've seen so many relationships in my practice where, like, let's say it was like an AP and a DA. And maybe when the DA takes their space because they need some space on a Sunday or whatever it is, they go to their AP partner and they give some words of affirmation first. And they say, hey, I'm going to take my 3 hours of space this afternoon, and then I'm going to be really present, after 2:00, and we'll really connect, and they'll be affirmative and give words of affirmation first. Or if they are feeling withdrawn and they're feeling burnt out, they may know just automatically to go to their partner and say, hey, just so you know, I'm feeling kind of in a funk, and it has nothing to do with you. I'm so happy and grateful for our relationship. I'm just tired. And then the person can turn around on the other side and go, hey, no problem. Like, can I support you somehow? Like, what can I do? And so, we're able by having that vulnerability, by showing ourselves, and by being mindful, because we learn about somebody else's core wounds and fears, we're able to navigate each other's sensitivities much more easily and effectively. And then what was originally all these points of conflict actually become and transform into points of connection. Because when somebody feels burnt out and they go to their partner and say, hey, I'm tired, and the person turns around and is like, I'm here for you, that feels like a connecting feature instead of something that drives you apart. Or if somebody's in a relationship where it's the opposite happening in an APDA dynamic, and somebody goes, okay, I really, feel like we're not connecting enough, and, I need some reinforcement or some validation or reassurance, or I need more quality time. The other person's like, hey, thanks for telling me. Okay, let's make a plan. And then these things are not these like unspoken of pain points or points of contention. They're all things that make us feel seen, heard, understood, and connected to our partners. So very, very important. And consistency will be important. And if there's something you didn't communicate about, being able to go back and say, hey, yesterday I realized something bothered me and I didn't communicate about it, and here's what it is. So don't expect yourself to like know everything right away and get it all right away or notice it right away. But as long as you're going to own and feel open to communicate, you're going to continuously see that needle move. So I would love if you guys share, if you feel comfortable and open to it, where you find yourself going wrong in the power struggle stage. So it can be in a current power struggle you're in, or it could be in a position where you are like looking at past relationships going, ouch, like this is where I have pain points. This is where I have challenges. This is where I get stuck. Okay, so let's see. I'm trying to see where I think you guys were chatting here. For me, okay, awesome. So I see a few. So always compromising. So always compromising isn't bad. It's always sacrificing that's bad, right? If you're always compromising, sometimes compromises are going to be good, but like compromises should feel like you're just like going a little outside of your comfort zone, not sacrificing, not being accountable for yourself at the same time. Or if you're the only one compromising, that's a big problem for sure. And that's where it becomes self-abandonment, right? So you want to be really good at like, is the person working with me? Amazing. Let's see. Everywhere, at least that's where the old me would have said. I like that. The awareness of the stories. Good job, Liv. Not speaking up right away. Amazing. And I noticed actually about you recently is that you keep speaking up. Like you keep asking questions where you're like speaking up, and like, that's going to serve you forever. Like, even if you have things like when you were sharing your question yesterday, where you're like, you said one thing and then you're like, wait, it's more like this. Like, amazing. Now you learn for next time, and you keep like growing and growing through increments. And eventually you'll just feel like you can talk to people about anything. And then you'll have relationships in your life where people can do the same and you feel comfortable navigating. So that's amazing. And also, like I was saying a second ago, if you're not speaking up right away, you can backtrack and go, yesterday something bothered me and I didn't realize it till later on. And that's fine. Like, we don't have to, always know exactly everything, but we can always come back to it. And as long as we're keeping that resentment tank on empty, that's where we end up being able to thrive. Feeling in a fog and confused in the power struggle stage and helpless. Is this the current relationship or past? Past. Okay. So what I would say too is if you're in that position, it's a really good opportunity to sit with yourself and like take some time to try to sort out your feelings. Like to me, I hear that you're a little bit too externally focused in the past, if that would happen, where you're like, okay, I'm busy in life, or I'm worrying about everybody else or this person. And it's like, hey, there's not time out. Whenever we're feeling confused or like kind of like, whoa, overwhelmed, I'm in this fog. We haven't taken enough time to actually sort through our feelings and get present inside of ourselves. So if you see that in future power struggles, then it's a good time to be able to go, okay, I have to sit with myself. What are the things that are bothering me? Why have they been upsetting me? And what do I need to happen instead? And then to pick a couple at a time to really go into conversation with. So great share. Thank you. For me, it's not expressing my needs because I'm afraid of rejection. That's such a great one too. So it's, sitting with that and going, okay, if I don't express my needs, I'm rejecting myself, right? Or if I don't express my needs, I'm rejecting my own needs. I'm making my needs bad or unworthy. So coming back to that and being able to be like, okay, where am I not expressing my needs? I'm, questioning my story around the rejection, and then expressing your needs in practicing that communication. And Andrea, like we were talking about too, it's like usually when we're so afraid of rejection, I remember like vividly, like this vivid memory, the first time I like really communicated a need that was vulnerable to me. It's like, I'm sure I'll remember it for the rest of my life because I remember I was so terrified. And I remember sitting there and being like, oh my gosh, I can't believe I'm going to say this. And, but like assuming rejection, like assuming, oh, I'm going to get so rejected from saying this. And then it went super well. And it was like the exact opposite outcome of what I expected. And realizing in that moment, like, oh, that's because I have these conditioned ideas about what it means to express my needs, right? Because of past history. And so sometimes we're carrying these ideas from like being a 4-year-old or a 5-year-old. And if we just didn't get needs met when we were vulnerable as a kid, from somebody, then there you go. You've got these like things popping back up again. And it's just these assumed pieces of programming. And you guys have heard me say this before, but it's like the elephant tied to a tree analogy, right? Where like there's this little baby elephant and it's tied to the tree. And then you see these huge elephants years later tied to a tree, and they don't even try to pull away because they just assume, oh, no, I'm stuck here now that I'm tied to this tree. And we have a lot of that within ourselves. So by doing a little bit of exposure work, you might be able to go, wow, this is actually really transforming the relationship and I'm worthy of so much more. And Andrea, I feel like you've also been showing up a lot more for your needs more recently. So awesome work. Not trying to go past it. I quit. That's the flight response. I'm out of here. And usually that's sometimes just the root at its core is this assumed, oh, well, it's not going to work anyways. So we just think, oh, it's not working, so I'm out of here because it would, if I don't see it working, it's not going to work. And most people, I think, really operate in that space. Like, I think that's a very common space to be in, but it's like, hey, then I have to disrupt what is happening to try to produce a different outcome. And that's when the power is back in your hands again. So great share. Not communicating well, not communicating, then being resentful. Resentment is always a symptom of like not feeling communicated or heard or understood. My way or the highway to feel safe. Yeah. That's a really good share too. And it's like, sometimes I control when I feel afraid, right? That's always what control is rooted in. It's just fear at its core. Having picked the wrong person in the first place who isn't willing to take me into consideration. That's a great share too, Sophia. And it's like really representative of that you didn't vet in the dating stage, right? So it's like, if you pick somebody who you knew was going to have non-negotiables, right? Or you didn't maybe consciously know, but you saw some red flags, but they kind of got filtered out. Then we eventually come to find, wait, this is somebody who, maybe it's one person wants a long-term relationship and the other person never wants a long-term relationship, or these things that would be non-negotiables, but we found a connection in the dating stage and we filtered that away. Oh, maybe it'll change. Or, oh, over time it can change. Or, oh, and we, instead of having like really clear conversations, then you find yourself back in that position long-term. So really good share. The only one compromising. I just saw that now. um, Not communicating effectively, sacrificing without explaining my needs. Yeah, that's such a good one too. And when you're in that position and you're going, okay, I sacrifice without explaining my needs. Again, that's going to boil down to like, then you feel like, look at all the things we feel when we do that. We feel unseen, we feel unheard, we feel misunderstood, we feel like we don't matter. We feel like we can't really trust a person sometimes, or they're probably going to abandon us because they don't care about us that much. And we assume that because that's how it feels when we don't feel like our needs are cared for or understood. But so much of that is actually just rooted in a lack of communication. And if we did communicate, we might see way different outcomes and feel so much more seen and heard and connected. So really good share. If we have a conflict, I thought it meant I need to leave, right? I've had a few people say that to me over the years, very, very specifically. I can think of one instance where a good friend of mine, like 10 years ago or so, was like, oh, in a conflict, it doesn't mean the relationship's over. and it's like a conflict means, and what I generally see with that too is that there's this lack of trust in yourself to be able to share what you need from the conflict or for it to be resolved. So that's a really good practice, is like, if you're thinking, oh, there's a conflict, that's the end. There's probably room for being more considerate of yourself and being like, hey, there's a conflict, it doesn't feel good. I'm going to go to this person and say what I would need for it to be different. And then if they say, no, I don't care about you or something, you can say, okay, fine, I'll leave. But the vast majority of the time when you present it vulnerably, like so many things in relationships, you'll be shocked. I was shocked to see this so much in my practice. So many things in relationships you'll see instead are people going, I had no idea you felt that way. Like, thanks for telling me. Or, oh, I don't feel like that, so I didn't realize you would feel like that. Okay, I'll be mindful of that next time. Like, so many things are so easily resolved more than you'd think, as long as you don't come in too hot, right? If you come in too hot and trigger the other person's defense response, if you're like, you did this, that doesn't work. I know you wouldn't do that anyways, Efrat, but if you come in and you say, hey, like yesterday, I don't know what you meant by it. It probably was an accident, but when you made that comment, it didn't land that well with me. Like, that kind of hurt. And that's a pain point for me. Can you try to be mindful of that next time? And a lot of times people are like, oh, I'm sorry, I didn't realize. And that's it. And then you feel like, oh, okay, I can trust this person again. Or, oh, okay, like they didn't mean harm. And sometimes people will say instead, like, hey, like that was meant to be this way, and it's a misunderstanding. And so there's so much opportunity for resolution instead. And the last thing I just want to add to that too is, like, when we don't share ourselves, we don't feel properly cared for. And so it's easier for our abandonment wounds to be triggered. Because if I don't feel like you see me and you're connected to me and who I really am deep down, my fears, my worries, then I don't feel like you're really looking out for me or taking care of me. And so the relationship feels more fragile, like it could end at any time. So those things can really go hand in hand there together. So great share. I lash out badly and criticizing instead of healthy communication. Oops. That's a good one, Warren. And that's such a beautiful point for growth, right? Because then you feel guilty and sad and all these things after, and it's like, no, you can just communicate earlier. So it doesn't have to get to that point of frustration. Okay. Amazing shares, you guys. So power struggle stage. So what you want to do so far here, right? Because power struggle is such a big stage, and we're going to talk stability can be a big stage where people leave as well. But try to look at, like, what are those patterns, whether I'm in a relationship now, or if I, in looking at my history of relationships, what are these patterns, and what am I going to be able to do to disrupt them, right? How am I going to communicate differently? What will be my practice ahead of time? What's my key lesson and learning? Because everything that hurts is just trying to show you something. So every time you can look at it and go, oh, this hurts, that's going to be a wake-up call for me to be like, okay, this doesn't feel good, I have to change something about it. Then you're constantly disrupting painful cycles in your life. And that leads to much more peaceful outcomes long-term. So stability stage is the stage of, like, once you've actually sort of developed those patterns, right? So you enter into the stability stage when you've learned to really navigate conflict. And you know how I said, like, you start to take each other into consideration more because you start to know each other on an inner world level at that point. So this ends up becoming that place of, okay, well, when I'm in stability stage, I'm able to take you into consideration. I know that you need some time alone, or I know that you need validation when I need time alone, or I know that, and so we naturally do those things, and we're naturally considerate of those things more often. And those habits get built out into the relationship, and we feel more cared for, more considered. And this is generally as well, especially when we've navigated into this stage, this is generally as well where we feel a lot more safe in our relationships, right? We feel like we can truly trust. Why? Because trust is so much about consideration. And so if we've appropriately given consistent information to our partners in order for them to properly consider us, now we feel like, oh, this person cares about me. We see it more, we feel it, we feel known, we feel more connected. And generally, minus certain exceptions that we'll talk about in a moment, generally at this part of a relationship, what we also see is the roots are deeper. Like it's people at this point. So I want you to think about, and this is valuable mostly for FAs and APs to hear, but DAs a little bit too. Let's think about like when people feel insecure in a relationship. So think about like a time where you felt jealous or possessive or afraid. Like, what if your partner is going to be interested in somebody else? Or what if they think that person's attractive, or whatever it is, like some kind of fear that you've had before. What if they like them and then they're going to abandon me? So try to think of like a fear that you've had before in that space. And then try to imagine that instead, at that moment in the relationship, you felt truly seen, truly known, really vulnerable, really open. You invest yourself and your time into your partner, and you know that your partner feels that same way. You know that your partner feels like you know their inner world. You feel like your partner knows that you know their fears, their flaws, and that they can trust you with those and to support them in that. And, they know they can come to you with anything and talk to you about anything, and that you guys just both know that you're going to be able to talk it out and move through it and build a deeper bond and deal with what gets thrown at you. At that point, the attractive person or these things that we get insecure about in earlier stages of relationships, when we're trying to stay in the honeymoon forever, or like all these things I would see with people, when somebody thinks it's just honeymoon and power struggle, somebody that your partner could infatuate with is scary, because it threatens the belief that, oh, relationships are just infatuation or power struggle. But when you have deepened that connection, the relationship becomes more unshakable. And those things that once might have posed fears to you when a relationship was based off of that more superficial level really don't have the ability to scare you in the same way, or scare your partner in the same way much longer, right? Because now it's like, okay, well, that's great that somebody is attractive, that your partner, sits at the cubicle next to at work or whatever, but they don't have all of that depth of the relationship that you spent all that time and effort and energy working on. And so this is what I mean by like when people think, oh, we have to stay in the honeymoon stage forever, or I'm going to be abandoned long-term, or, it's not going to work out and then it's going to turn into something, or they're going to get bored of me long-term. Those things are what people have stories around when they think that as soon as the infatuation fades, it's doom for the rest of the relationship, right? And that's, again, that indication that probably you haven't had the opportunity to move beyond that stage of relationships before. So you assume that, but once you deepen that connection and you open up, it's like nobody wants to consciously violate or hurt or harm or betray something that's so meaningful to them at both a conscious and subconscious level, right? Once you feel like I trust this person, they know me, I know them, we trust each other, we open up about things, we talk through things, then these external dynamics of relationships, they don't really pose much of a threat. So I wanted to sort of talk about that for a moment, just because I know a lot of people, it's very common for people who are insecurely attached to not be able to go beyond the power struggle stage, and then to think The infatuation's fading, the relationship's on its way out, all these bad things are going to happen, and to act out or to become afraid or all these different things, when actually that's a call for, hey, guess what time it is? It's time to practice taking off the mask and deepening the connection now, because that infatuation is fading. And this is a normal progression of a relationship in its life cycle. So the stability stage. So what are we trying to get out of the stability stage? It's actually like a resting point in the life cycle of a relationship. There's an opportunity to feel like you're settling in. There's that security, there's that comfort, there's that familiarity, there's that formation of good habits that have already happened. There's the feeling like you're more of yourself. The places where it can go wrong is with fearful avoidance. More than anybody else, really. Usually by the stability stage, DAs are probably not going anywhere. DAs derive so much comfort and safety from the relationship at that point. They tend to be very invested stability stage forward. And generally as well, to make it to the stability stage, you've had to do a lot of work to become at least fairly secure, each of you, because doing all the things you'd have to do to get there, communicate, know your needs, share your needs, discuss your boundaries, open up about your flaws, like those are all secure things. So generally you have like a predominantly secure relationship at this point. Whether both of you have a primary secure style or one's primary and one's secondary, like generally there's a lot of security having been built and reconditioned through the habits you use to get beyond that power struggle stage. But sometimes I see if a fearful avoidant, like let's say one of you in here is dating an FA, and the FA isn't really working on themselves, and so you're kind of leading the way. Sometimes if a fearful avoidant hasn't reprogrammed their subconscious comfort zone to get outside of chaos, sometimes they'll associate stability with boredom. And the reason for this is that if FAs, if their subconscious comfort zone in relationship to self and in relationship to their caregivers, their upbringing, all these different things, if their comfort zone is always to feel like they're on the roller coaster, when they're off the roller coaster, they're like, what's going on here? Like, this doesn't feel exciting. And so that if you ever experience that, and sometimes APs can actually have a little bit of that too. If you ever experience that, it's actually one of the first things you can work on is nervous system regulation. And it can also be indicative that like, hey, you're still in this disrupted state or a state of chaos internally at a nervous system level. And so you're like, I'm restless, and AKA my nervous system is restless. And so when the relationship is calm and I am a restless person, it doesn't feel like a match. And then what do? Our subconscious comfort zone wants familiarity. So it may push away or try to sabotage things that don't feel familiar. And again, like, remember the goal of relationships when we really want to move beyond this, is the goal of relationships is ideally, if this is what you're wanting, of course, unless you're in a stage where you're like, I just want to date around and see what I like and see what my interests are and learn about myself in the process. But generally, a lot of people's goals in relationships should be to get to the bliss stage. If you want a happy, healthy relationship, because you've got that like infatuation feeling and excitement and chemistry with the person and that great sort of connection, but in a much more unconditional way. Whereas in the honeymoon and dating stage version of that, my mask is on. So it's still much more conditional. So we're trying to get to that like unconditional space, right? And if we start sabotaging in that space because I'm like, I'm restless, I need the roller coaster, I don't know how to not be on the roller coaster, then we want to be like, it's safe to feel loved, it's safe to be safe, and do some nervous system regulation work. And those are sort of some of the dominant stories to work on. So you don't go into like, I'm bored, I need to push this person away. And unfortunately, sometimes I've worked with clients who have come in and said, like, I pushed somebody away that I shouldn't have. Everything was going great. We like really got vulnerable. We really opened up. And then, I eventually was like, oh, it's too good to be true, or this feels uncomfortable. I'm not used to having this kind of connection. And I sabotage it. And so this can happen sometimes if there's a lot of comfort zone of history and chaos. And again, that means reprogramming inner subconscious comfort zone so that stage of a relationship also matches and feels like a subconscious comfort zone as well. So next stage, commitment stage. So a lot of people get married or make big serious commitments not in the commitment stage. The commitment stage is like kind of the best stage of a relationship to make these choices, because you will have confidently seen that you can move through all the other stages. So the commitment stage at this point is, the recognition that it's time to take the next steps. Usually at this point, you've gotten into the stability stage, caught your breath, you see that the relationship's in this really good flow, and you're like, okay, like I can't really see my life without this person. Like things are so good. I wouldn't want to ever not have this as a part of my life. And when people make really strong commitments in the commitment stage, generally they're more successful long term. So at this point, you usually have these things that are, again, setting you up to thrive in the bliss stage. You usually have vetted the person early on, right, from the dating stage, and know that this person has things that you need and find compatible within the relationship. There's no non-negotiables. When there are red flags, you've addressed them, you've found healthy compromises and worked through them. You've had that excitement and fun and joyful time together in the honeymoon stage where it's more carefree. But then you've also effectively dropped the mask and opened up and shared and talked about your fears and feelings and needs, which has then allowed you to establish those really strong and effective habits for the relationship. Where now all of a sudden you're going, okay, we're in this great space. We know how to naturally consider each other and our differences. We're okay with our differences because we've got these great habits for navigating them effectively. And I feel way more understood and known by this person because I've allowed myself to be vulnerable and open up. And we found ways to communicate. So communication through differences, through points of contention, through external challenges of life doesn't feel so scary. It feels really normal to do. And so now you're in a place where it's like, okay, then we've been in this place for a while. Now we're ready to talk about like the future, the next steps. And this is where, if you've done all the other things properly, you'll generally feel a sense of confidence at this stage of the relationship. Sometimes when I would see people come into my practice, then there can be multiple things going on, but sometimes I would see people who are like, I'm getting married in 2 months and I decided I wanted to come and seek counseling because what if I'm making the wrong decision? Or I'm scared that I'm doing the wrong thing, and I'm scared that I'm with the wrong person. And what if I regret it? And what I would hear when I would hear somebody saying that is there's needs you haven't communicated about and you're not in a flow with, or there's boundaries or fears you don't feel like are seen and known and understood. And there's these parts of yourself that feel unknown to your partner, this person you're going to spend the rest of your life with, or that feel like they're not being supported or looked out for, or that feel like, you're hiding from the partner. And so this is coming up and creating anxiety and chaos. And instead, if you feel fully integrated in your relationship at this point, where like, I can be totally myself, I'm seen and known, I'm understood. If there's a pain point or challenge, I trust very much that we can work through it together. That's where we feel a greater sense of confidence. Okay. So there can be stories you have too. There can, all commitment ends in chaos or whatever. And you can work through those stories if you see any specific stories coming up. But generally, if you've done this work before, by the commitment stage, there's a sense of calm around the commitments, right? There's not this sense of panic or fear or, all those things that you'll see on like television programs, or I've seen in my client practice or things like this. So, this is actually a great stage to make those long-term commitments. But to do this stage properly, you also have to have conscious conversations, right? If you go, okay, commitment stage, let's take the next steps. That's great. Leo and I never see you on camera. Hi. I'm like, wow. So generally when you're in this place, it's a really great time to be like, okay, we're going to unpack the proper conversation and dialogue that we need to have to move the needle. And sometimes where people can go wrong is they don't really do that part. They're like, oh, we're great, so we'll just go into the relationship. But it's always really good. It's almost like the commitment stage is like a secondary dating stage, but for the long term. So like in the dating stage, you're like, my non-negotiables, my likes, my dislikes, my preferences, you talked it out, you chatted about these things. And then at this place of the relationship, instead, you want to be like, okay, let's talk about these things in the future, where we want to live, what kind of lifestyle habits we want to have, how much money we want to spend, how we want to organize our bank accounts, how we want to raise our children if you're going to have kids, what schools we want the kids to go to. Like there are these important things. And it's just because, again, like whatever we're not intentional about, we'll learn the hard way. So like imagine you do all these other things right in the relationship up until this point, and then all of a sudden, you're with somebody and you think in the back of your mind, oh, like we're for sure going to homeschool our kids, or, whatever it might be. And then later on, you're like, oh, I just thought you'd be cool with it. Cause we talk about these things. So the more you can talk about these things ahead of time, you're just going to save yourself the pain points, potential challenges of having to do this stuff the hard way later. So this stage is really characterized by like open discussion, honesty, transparency, a little bit of planning, even for those of you who are like, don't love planning, but it will be naturally like an evolution of these things. In the advanced attachment style courses, we actually have, I think it's like 60 questions in the workbook, and it's like 60 questions before a deep commitment. And it's like the things that I recommend, hey, get these things off the list, like knock these things off, have these conversations ahead of time, get intentional. And again, it's sort of like that conflict communication thing where you're like, if there's a difference that we have, how can we make those compromises, put all of our cards on the table, be open, be transparent, and then find somewhere where this stuff can meet in the middle, find a way we can consolidate our differences in a healthy form. And so the more you can do that, the easier this becomes, right? And then you get to the bliss stage, right? Which is you vetted a person, you're happy with your choices and outcome, you both have needs that are important to you. And because, and this is one of the coolest things about, I always used to say to people in my practice, like you either grow together or you grow apart. And when you know that you can constantly work through problems, when you know you can master conflict communication, you're going to keep growing together, because when there's a problem or a difference, you come to each other and you talk it out. There's no avoidance or a wall goes up or a pushing away or something like that. You know that you're going to come together and talk about it and make compromises and fit it into each other's life. So that's kind of like the binding remedy that will help to ensure that you're constantly growing together. And so when that's really worked through in that stage, and you're with somebody you're compatible with and you enjoy your time with, and all these other things are checked off and right, well, now you can enter into the bliss stage. And you've had all those conversations, you've done everything else we've talked about, built those healthy habits. And generally what's left at the bliss stage is it's characterized by wanting to go out into the world and create things together. So you'll see, some of the key components of the bliss stage. Sometimes you'll hear people call it the co-creation stage, where it's like this collective empowerment of the relationship. You choose to buy that house together and set up your home, or you choose to have kids together and create a life for them, or you choose to contribute to some kind of charity together or start a business together or whatever it is, where you're like coming together to create together. And the bliss stage is what goes on for the rest of the relationship. You can regress back into previous stages, but it's very, very rare to do so. Generally, instead, what you're going to see is once you're in that stage, there's a lot of progression. So this is a point where generally what you've hopefully learned is that love is not just infatuation. It's not just power over some other person. It's not just stability and comfort. And it's not just showing up for a commitment. It's really like so much more beyond that, because we often think like, oh, love is just infatuation if we're stuck in the honeymoon and then we break up. Oh, love is just about who has the upper hand if you're always in power struggles in your relationship. It's definitely not that either. And that hurts to feel like it is. It hurts to believe that about relationships, right? It cuts you off from other people and makes you feel lonely and isolated. Love is not just stability, right? It's not just about, oh, okay, let's just get comfortable with somebody. No, there's so much more richness to it than that. And it's not just showing up to commit to something, right? There's all these other things. You can have a long-term commitment, but that doesn't necessarily mean a successful relationship. A successful relationship should feel like there's a thriving, right? There's like a harmony, there's an enjoyment of each other's company, there's an excitement to spend time together, there's an interest, there's still a chemistry, and there's a tremendous amount of depth and trust and understanding and support of each other as you see each other as you truly are, right? Truly know each other at that point. So that's it for this webinar.